Welcome to the Teacher's Toolkit for Literacy, the free podcast for motivated teachers and school leaders who want to inspire their students and school community in literacy learning. Make sure you subscribe to the show on your favourite podcast player, and for more amazing literacy resources, check out the show notes provided with every episode.
Hi, I'm Sharon, and I'm the host of a Teacher's Toolkit for Literacy. In every Toolkit episode, we bring you specific resources, tools, strategies, tips, techniques to help you in your job as a teacher of literacy. Firstly, we acknowledge and pay our respects to the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians whose ancestral lands we gather on. We acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and relationship of the Kaurna people to country, and we respect and value their past, present, and ongoing connection to the land and cultural beliefs. Hello, everybody.
And welcome everyone to the podcast. In every Toolkit episode, we bring you specific resources, tools, strategies, tips, techniques to help you in your job as a teacher of literacy. Welcome newcomers to the podcast. We hope you get a lot out of our session today. We're really fortunate to have Mark Macleod with us today. Mark is a senior lecturer at Charles Sturt University. Welcome, Mark.
Oh, thanks, Phil. Hi, Sharon. How are you?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Mark. Thanks for joining us.
So, Mark, what is your background in? It's in literacy and other things.
I set out right from the time. Well, I suppose really as an undergraduate in university, I set out to know everything I could about the way books are produced for children and the way they're consumed by children, and so that's involved me in writing and editing and even book selling, publishing, currently a publisher of an independent press for children called Dirt Lane Press. It's involved me in promoting and marketing. I've even stood up in Myer department stores and done barking with a sort of bullhorn almost.
Right.
Well, it's my mother standing in the back of the crowd. Kind of intimidating. When I was 17, I remember I'd gone out some, celebratory night, I suppose it was, and I came home and my mother and father were both in bed pretending not to be waiting up for me to get home. And my mother, I stood at the foot of the bed and she said, "And what do you want to do when you leave school?" And I said, "Well, I either want to be an English teacher or go to art school." And there was a silence and she said, "Well, I suppose if you have to be an English teacher."
Oh.
Wow. And I mean, I've thought about that many times since, and I think, of course, for her, the idea of becoming a full-time artist was just too risky. Actually, at the time, I could have made some money. I'm not sure that you could now, if you set yourself up. But I took the safe road and decided I want to do that, and I took lots of open doors along the way.
Yes, and it's found you in many interesting places and roles.
Oh, absolutely. I love that. I love that about it. And, you know, one of my favourite things that any Australian writer says is John Marsden, who writes in children's books, take risks. And he's so right, you know, because we live in a risk-averse society that wants to make sure everything is neatly planned and all our outcomes match our aims and everything like that. Sorry, folks, life isn't like that.
No.
The most interesting things, in fact, my first university job was when I was heading down to Adelaide. My wife had found a place to rent. I had a scholarship to go to Flinders University. I had a wonderful supervisor, Brian Matthews, had a good topic and everything like that. And my wife was in Adelaide, and 2 days before I was to fly down there, the head of my school at Macleod University came in and said, "I'm here to offer you a job."
Oh, wow.
And I said, "You know that I'm going to Adelaide to be a PhD student, and you know my wife's down there, and you know." And she said, "Yes, I know that." And I said, "And you also know you've got me over a barrel." And he said, "Yes, I know that too."
Right. So which door now?
Wow, what an amazing person Pam was, because she gave up that little dream in order for me to have that job. In the long run, I don't regret it, but, you know, I'm talking about surprises and taking risks. And that was something I was not expecting, and it turned out to be useful. So I do want to encourage teachers and kids and parents and so on, don't take the safe road in either teaching or reading or writing or anything else, or in life, for goodness sake, take risks.
Yeah. I really like what you said about, that the world doesn't work that way, that we have got, this plan and it's all going to turn out like this. And I think that is we especially need to keep that in mind when we're thinking about the students who we are working with, because we need to have those doors opening for them so that then, that we haven't just got the set, well, this is exactly how this has got to play out and in this time frame and in this order, when in fact life and teaching and learning becomes so much more exciting when all of that's open.
And I think that the key to that is empowering teachers, as we should empower parents, to feel confident that whatever way circumstances jump, they can respond to it. So to go in there with a plan and then somebody says something in the class and that isn't in the plan, your best strategy is to feel confident enough to drop it and just respond to that student, because that's real.
Yes.
I well remember my first year of teaching at Sydney Grammar School, and we were teaching Anthem for Doomed Youth and Wilfred Owen, and it was, of course, during the war, and, well, which war? The Vietnam War. And, yikes. And I went into the classroom and I had a wonderful lesson prepared, and I had forgotten it was Cadet Day and every single kid in the class was in uniform. Oh my goodness. Now, instead of going, no, we'll do something else, I let that happen, and I ended up with kids in tears in that class. That's not something I wanted. It's not something I desired, but it's something I was very grateful for as a learning moment for the students and for me. So that's what I mean about helping teachers or enabling teachers and enabling parents to think, it doesn't matter what you throw at me, I'm going to be able to catch it and we'll do something useful with it. It's not going to spoil my day if you don't go according to my plan. The plan will keep. I can deal with it another time.
Yes. And off plan doesn't mean no plan.
No, of course not. Of course not. No.
Just means
but don't let your plan show too much either. I think sometimes. Because then it can become the primary focus. Yes. I think the most interesting teaching I've experienced is where the teacher clearly knows what she is doing, and that makes me feel confident. But she's not kind of pushed for time and says, "Oh, well, we need to be getting onto this now," that kind of thing. And that can only come from being well prepared. And being flexible too.
Yes, I think that's the word. Flexibility is, knowing what you want to do, but being flexible to know that we can go in this direction, divert here, and know how that actually is going to empower or enable just where we were going, and strengthen it and add to it and deepen it.
So, Mark, what's your current role?
My current role, I am doing part-time teaching and full-time editing. I'm editing for a couple of publishers in Australia and in India, and Dirt Lane Press. So doing all those sorts of things. Also volunteering with refugees and a whole lot of communal things.
And your teaching is university?
Part-time.
Students. In literacy or?
You know what? And you're going to hate me for saying this. I really hate that word. I was really excited when I was asked to go back to Macleod University to teach for one semester, and they said, "We've had enough of the word literacy. We want you to teach literature." And I know why people use literacy, and I know why it's there, but I think sometimes people have they freeze when they hear that word. Because they're worried that it sounds sort of beyond them or something like that, or maybe it sounds humorless. I'm not sure.
We certainly, when we're talking about literacy, as in, a lesson in the classroom, we really talk about using literature. We call it tantalising text, so that the kids have got really drawn to what they're reading. But using that literature as a central part of your teaching, and also that the kids have really great access to fantastic books in their classroom, directly in their classroom.
Yeah.
So two things, them having the access and also the teacher using it centrally in their teaching. So it comes from the literature. So you've got really rich models of the English language that's supporting every lesson.
Which
I mean, 100%, and I realise that you do use the term. I've got the freedom to say I don't use it very much.
Yes.
But for example, some research in Finland, people admire Finnish education and research and regard it very highly, quite rightly so. But when they talk about home literacy models, guess how interesting that sounds to me as either a parent or a kid. It sounds like work.
Yeah.
And it sounds like assessment and so on. And if I could bury those requirements, I would. I don't mean I just free for all. Obviously, we've got a kind of, sort of like be guides who are just, that game we used to play when the kids going warmer, 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 colder, colder, colder.
Yes.
I used to love that game. And as somebody was blindfolded and sort of walked towards whoever it was, I sort of think that's my role as both an editor and a teacher and a parent for that matter. Not to say you're wrong, you're on the wrong track, but just to kind of guide gently.
Actually, I'm just going to throw in there, I remember quite some time back now, where it really dawned on me about that the term literacy is actually, it's more active than I think we currently construct it, because literacy is actually about choosing and using, like numeracy is choosing and using, that the ACY is actually making something active. And so from that point of view, when we're really building a literate being, it is empowering them, though, with what they can choose and use, which
at its best, yeah.
At its best, yes.
Yeah. And I mean, while I'm saying I'd rather use the word literature, I'm perfectly well aware that sounds elitist and it doesn't sound like active. It sounds like a thing, and it's often got a capital L. I know all those problems.
Yeah.
I kind of like the word reading, which you can apply to pictures and movies and video games as well as, print on the page or on the screen. But anyway, those are just terms. But it just worries me sometimes when that becomes a word that is shared with the kids. It's great. It's fine for professionals to talk about it, but I just worry about the impression that it gives to kids. That's all.
I absolutely get that, yes. Which actually leads us into today's topic.
Yeah.
Sorry. No. Yeah, here I'm raving off for half an hour and we finally get to the topic there. Sorry.
No, that's all good. That's what robust conversation should be, because I was thinking, do we mention the topic or do we just keep going on this track?
Anyway, the topic is the value of independent reading.
Shall we explain why we thought we'd have today's session too, which is really come to us from a number of teachers that have either emailed us or chatted with us about this idea of the value or the perceived value of independent reading, and what lets us know that it's a valuable part of carving out time in our day for children to be reading at school. Because that's really where it's come from, where people have said...
Is there research that
that backs
that up? Or?
This time being given to children reading for themselves at school, which we really want to unpack a lot of things around that today. So we would talk about that the essential components, that's not just, this time carved out all on its own, but it's wrapped with a whole lot of parts to that there would be time for students to self-select.
Yep.
So that's what we would classify as an important component of independent reading, is that it's time for self-selection and that there's the opportunity to read, to build stamina, to read and to practice with a wide variety of texts of choice over a year. But that, yes, it's been wrapped with a teacher making it explicit about the what and the why and the how readers, what they're actually doing as they're reading.
I think it's helpful to go back to the 1960s and see it in historical context. I think an interesting starting point would be the Real Books movement back in the 60s, where certainly when I was at school, we grew up with basically basal readers, and the idea of using a real genuine book in the classroom rather than something that being constructed for us to learn from was a long way away. And then in the 60s too, sustained silent reading was developed in the United States, really. And I think that what we've got with independent reading is kind of a bridge between sustained silent reading, which was known by other names like Drop Everything and Read, which I kind of liked, I must say, because it sort of gave an excitement and a spontaneity to the idea. And that was about putting aside some time for the students to choose their books to read without any kind of structured input from the teacher. But then, and what a typical response to basal readers from the 1960s, to sort of say, yep, it's all, if it feels good, do it. Free love, make love, not war, all that sort of thing. Yep, you have just silent reading, sustained silent reading, choose whatever you like, do whatever you like, 30 minutes, and you'll be fine and it will make you a good reader. And it did for many people. But inevitably, the question of accountability came in, and I think what we had with scaffolded silent reading was a response to the question of whether that time was being used profitably, and also whether it really gave the teacher enough of a kind of enough of a role or an intervention, I suppose, in a way. And independent reading is something that I think is somewhere between those two goals. Because for me, independent reading, yes, the student chooses the books, but of course there is a level of choice beyond that, and that is that the teacher helped choose the selection in the first place, or the available collection for the kids. The children do choose their own books, and there is a variety of books, as you say. I'm not sure that always there are books that are risky. I think increasingly in the classroom, people used to badmouth librarians, and that was actually really misplaced. The librarians as gatekeepers and censors, because if you think about librarians' role, traditionally it is to have all the books. Librarians want to have all the books all the time, and traditionally they didn't really want you to borrow them. They just wanted them to be there in the library. Now, libraries are wonderful because I can't believe that I go to the library and I say, what's my maximum number of books? And they go 35.
Yes.
I go, what? Having grown up with a university library that said 2 books at a time, or a public library that said 5 books max, 35, how wonderful, I think the real concern where a lot of the risk-taking got reined in was complaints from parents to teachers, and a feeling that a class set of books was actually imposing something on the child. Whereas, and I think we got those two things confused. Making a book available in the library, if a child wants to choose it, is a completely different matter from having a syllabus and saying, you will read this. Now, independent reading tries to negotiate between those two and says, well, it's the teacher's role to amass a collection, but then it's for the students to choose from that. In independent reading also, there are many teachers set a kind of a set of goals for the kids, along with the kids. So, sort of talking about, it's like ground rules in a workshop, really. What are the ground rules for this group? Well, that you should respect other people's right to read, and that you should, keep to yourself during that reading time, that you should get right into your reading, don't waste time, that you should enjoy it. A kind of weird instruction in a way to sort of say it's important for you to enjoy this book. You will enjoy it, but that's an important part of it. And then to be able to specify what your intention is in the reading. What's the goal? I think it's also, for many people using independent reading, that there is a need to or a requirement to show how we're going to respond to that reading experience. So what options are there? Are there going to be reading response journals? Are there going to be post-it notes? Are there going to be talks or writing about it or whatever? So that there are set reading goals to it, There is research to show that it does impact, particularly in the early years of school. Research showing that in the first 2 years of school, it is very valuable and can be a good predictor of children's confidence and expertise in reading in the next couple of years. There is some research saying that if you have independent reading successfully working in year 1, there is a track for year 5 and year 6 where it does seem that it produces for some people more confidence in reading, more skill and more enjoyment. But the research, there's so much of the research, but some of it is very contradictory. So it's not easy to make sort of pat conclusions about the effectiveness of independent reading. I think the most important thing about independent reading is that the teacher models reading as well. That it's not just you do it and I'll sort of be up here and I'll do little conferences with you. It's the teacher is involved in reading too. And for sure, that is the most successful strategy at home to create a reading culture in the home, is for you as parents to be keen readers. And if maybe some people will remember a program in the United States years ago and a little bit in Australia called Get Caught Reading. And there were posters and ads about, famous people getting caught reading. That's a really smart way of making reading attractive. Make it a little bit risky, a little bit naughty. Don't make it too much a kind of obligation and work. As a bookseller, I can certainly remember people coming into a bookshop and you would show them with great enthusiasm a new book and the child would say, "Oh, we did that at school." There's nothing more disheartening to hear than that, So whatever it is that will generate a feeling of love of reading and just plain enjoyment and having fun, that's the important aspect of independent reading, I think.
Yeah. So really that talk, about the, like in a secondary setting, I think that would, where there might be a class set of, books that, or everyone in the class is doing the same book, and that term that you've just used, we did that book in school. In the primary setting, I don't usually see so much where a whole class is doing like the same book, but the power of the read aloud is definitely there, where a teacher may, not every child might have a copy of the book, but through the read aloud, bringing that read aloud, we definitely need teachers modelling, the enjoyment of reading, and that the read aloud really over time, we might not be getting students to do lots of written responses around it, but we're definitely opening up discussion and noticings and wonderings. And so do you see that, really the read aloud is required to sit alongside of getting
100%.
children. Yes, yeah.
100%. My earliest recollection of a teacher just simply loving to read was when I was 10 years old, and I was hopeless at cricket, and I'm not sorry about that. But, you were supposed to be sorry about it, let me tell you, if you're a boy at the time. But our teacher was a crazy cricketer and spent most of lunch hour playing cricket with the kids who loved to play cricket. And then, sweating profusely and exhausted and breathless, he would come into the classroom when lunchtime was over, and he'd perch on the edge of his desk and he'd say, "I just have to read you this." And he would read a poem or a bit of a story, and we were just completely enthralled with his read aloud. And the best bit about it was he didn't ever ask us to say anything about it after. And that really is aligned with something David Malouf said years ago, the Australian novelist, which I thought was so wise. He said, "Why do we assume that the natural response to a work of art is to talk about it?" There are many experiences where we do want to talk about a work of art, and sort of unpack our responses to it. But there are many times when I just want everybody to shut up and leave it alone and leave me in that world. I actually, as a university student, I stopped going to the movies or to the theatre with my peers because there were a couple who I'd be sort of lost back there in the 17th century with Shakespeare or wherever it was, or Picnic at Hanging Rock. I'd be up there with those girls in amongst the rock, lost and with that dreamy music. And you'd come out onto the marquee lights out in George Street in Sydney, and instantly someone would launch into an analysis of the movie we'd just seen. I just, I didn't want to listen. I didn't want to be there. I just leave me in my imagined world there. And I think while obviously we want students to be able to articulate their responses, sometimes we don't, and sometimes it gives them great freedom and dignity and respect to just sit with your feelings about that, and let's go on with whatever the next lesson is. Maybe it's maths or something like that, and that's what that teacher did for us.
Yeah, and in fact, the internal response is already happening. It doesn't have to be outside of us. We're all, that whole idea of the whole time we are listening or watching text, whether it's a movie or whether it's, listening to our teacher read to us, there's all kinds of thought processes going on there and responses to that already. And I think that's what, can sometimes be deflating for students afterwards is, if it's got to be now write your response to, you go, oh my goodness, I've just had a whole world of responses going on there and thoughts and ideas and wonderings, and now to even catch that just seems like almost a trite thing to do sometimes.
Well, I have two Margaret Clark stories that will be relevant to what you're saying. When I published Back on Track by Margaret Clark, which so many students loved, and it didn't win any awards or anything like that, but it was a book that gripped a lot of people. And I gave it to my eldest daughter to read, and she read it, and she rang me the next morning at work, and she said, "I finished that book, and I tried to read a book after it, but everything else was trivial." And I thought, wow, and that's from a book that the critics and the professors of English and so on didn't think much of, but it really grabbed that student.
Yeah.
I went with Margaret Clark to a school, and it was not about Back on Track, it was about another book, and this was Kegworth School in Leichhardt in Sydney, always a really great, dynamic school. And Margaret was visiting the class, and the teachers were predicting she'd be talking to a couple of hundred kids. One of the boys said to the principal, "I am not attending Margaret Clark's talk. I don't want to hear Margaret Clark. I don't want to see her. I don't know why I have to do it." On the day, he sat at Margaret Clark's feet, almost between her legs, with his hand up most of her talk. overlooked it. I mean, it wasn't that she was ignoring him, but she knew he'd be all right, just sitting there with his hand up. And when she got to a point in the talk where she could stop, she said to him, "Do you have a question?" And he said, "Yes. Where does your imagination go at night?"
Oh, wow.
Mm.
Oh, yeah.
Now, that exactly demonstrates what you're saying.
Yeah.
That child had spent the week before saying he didn't want to have anything to do with this school visit, didn't want to see Margaret Clark or hear her. He sat there during the whole time, not responding apparently, except having his hand up. And when she let him speak, that was his question. What a knockout experience.
Yeah. We can't know, can we? We just, and we don't always have to know, but to give.
And I think that's about, and knowing that is about trusting the children.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. And it's actually between the author and the listener or the reader that things are happening. And that's the relationship happening right there. It's what we're doing as we're listening, as we're reading. That's the real reading process, isn't it? You know, it's not, okay, what do we remember now after, or what do we have to talk about after because now we know this. It's actually that complete process of it that is the untrackable and the trusting journey that we need readers. That's really what we want our young readers to engage in as they are reading and listening.
I think that was one of the most exciting changes in the conceiving of a literary work while I was growing up, was that I suppose when I was younger, and certainly in school, the implication of most teaching was that the author stroke narrator was the storyteller and was omniscient and had this whole story in her head or his head, and my job was to receive it and to understand it and interpret it. And then sometime towards the end of the 20th century, that was flipped around, and the author and the reader met in the middle, and the middle was the book, the text. And it's not exactly to say, as some kids when I was at school used to say, well, that's what I think it means and I've got a right to whatever I think. Yeah, up to a point. I mean, there are certain kind of limits on that in terms of what a word, you know, what the dictionary meaning of a word is, for example, and so on. And there may be contextual issues with how we interpret what's going on in a scene. But I think what it did was really made readers feel that they were collaborating with the writer.
Yeah.
And that in a sense they were both learning. And so I don't think it was a fake when authors would say, oh, gee, I never thought of that, you know. Because I think genuinely artists don't always know what they have created.
There was a conversation, I don't know, between a book and the reader that I read, would have been back in the 80s now, and that for me was as a teacher, was a real turning point, thinking it is in conversation, you know, the reader and the author can't know what the reader's going to gain from what they've said. And I absolutely agree that in all those times that authors go, I didn't know that that's what you would get from that, because that's what life's like. We don't know what someone's response is going to be to, to things that just happen in life.
So, Mark, going back to independent reading, if a school's questioning whether that is a useful activity, what would you say to them? Knowing that it can be that, well, I've done it myself, where we take the whole class into the school library. They can choose all the books that they want for the collection. It's not me selecting the books. And then they bring them back to the classroom as their selection of books that they're going to read, and they might keep them for a while and then change them over again. But having that time every day to practice their reading, just like every day they practice their writing, schools questioning whether that's a valuable thing, what would you say to them?
Well, I would probably, for many parents, use a sporting analogy and say that training is what makes you into a competent sports person. And people I know who swim say they swim every day because they're not wanting to win Olympic gold medals, but they know that makes them stronger and more confident. And therefore, that repeat practice of reading can increase your confidence. I think, secondly, I would say that it's about enjoyment of variety and empowering young people to make their own choices with the books. And yes, I think it's true that many schools do allow the students to make their collections, but I know schools where the teacher has made the selection, albeit a very clever one and a good one, but there's a variety of choices. I think
because that choice is really critical, isn't it? That the students are really getting the text that they really want to read.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that needs to go without too much judgment.
Yeah. And that's the first thing to get right, and then it's reading those books that they really want to read. I think there's research from Richard Allington about that, that it's choosing books that they want to read, and then it's lots of reading time to read.
Adults. Adults, I think, often question the kinds of books that children want to read. For example, Captain Underpants and Dogman. Two hugely successful series. If you as an adult just take a glance at them, you think, oh, that looks pretty rubbishy, doesn't look like there's much content in that. Actually, if you look at it more closely, they're very clever. And you could take a sort of postmodern literary criticism approach to them and make useful kind of analyses and comments on what's going on. So they're not just rubbish. And there have been works written in praise of, quote, rubbish. Gary Cruz said years ago in Australia, don't just dismiss the most popular series because they're what you would call reader makers. All the parents who, when I was younger, were concerned about their kids reading Babysitters, all the parents who were worried about their kids reading Goosebumps, and so on it goes. Yeah. And my answer to that is, where are the 40-year-olds and 50-year-olds still reading them? What it did was it was a really important stage where the child was collecting their reading experiences, and that's why the numbering of series is really important on the spine of a book, because kids like to collect, and that impulse to collect is really important. It's an important part of reading competence and confidence. So I think all of this goes into independent reading.
So is it that we have to really get clear on what the definition of independent reading is, before we can say the research says this about it?
Definitely.
Yeah, and is there enough research on what we're talking about as independent reading?
It's contradictory. There is enough on the early years, and/or the research that I've read on the later years is quite contradictory. So, well, for example,
but what sort of independent reading are they talking about? Because there are different aspects to this, aren't there? The choice of the books, the kids selecting all the books that they want, how much time you spend on it.
Whether you're reading with accuracy and understanding.
Yeah, what the teacher's role is during it. I mean, there's so many variables there. What research are looking at to say that independent reading is good or not so good? Is it just too many differences to find research on something to say it's a standard thing about independent reading? Or
I think wading through it is pretty challenging. So when you're looking at let's say independent reading for really young kids and kind of encouraging them to make their own choices, whether it's at home or at school, does that lead to greater reading rates later on? The answer may be that, and there's some pretty odd genetic-based research on this, suggesting that good readers are kind of confirmed by those experiences, but it's not clear whether that comes from some predilection to reading in the family and in the child, or is it from the culture of reading in the classroom, the feeling that it's being given an importance by the teacher or by the parents. And I come back to what the teacher or the parent does herself. Be seen reading a book and leave the book around casually for the child to find. One of the things in my family at the moment is I've got a 4-year-old who's just started school, and she has a 9-year-old cousin whose favourite books are Dogman and Pokemon at the moment. Well, she desperately wants to read Dogman, and she brings me Dogman and asks me to read them to her. I sort of look across the top of the book at her parents and kind of look questioningly at them. She stays with the book throughout. She doesn't understand everything that's in there, but she has this kind of, number one, a desire to be reading the books that other kids are reading. Number two, there's possibly a little bit of enjoyment of the fact that some adults in the room don't think that it's appropriate, including me. And number three, she has this confidence that if she can just get to the end of the book, she'll get it. And, of course, what helps with Dogman is the pictures. So, when you were talking before, the importance of pictures in picture books, the importance of music and dance and movement in supporting our understanding of words. So to make it a whole experience using all those other kind of experiences, I think is what is important.
You're saying it's really important for the teacher to model it and then have time to practice. But if the research is a bit mixed in the upper grades, is it something that we should be spending time on or not? What's your view on it? Independent reading.
I think there's enough research showing that in the lower grades it is successful, that it is important. And there's some pretty impressive research on the way that it empowers disadvantaged kids and kids with various abilities. One of the things that may be included in a collection is wordless books, for example, wordless picture books. Now, some teachers are a bit doubtful about the use of those. Some parents and some booksellers worry about it, but to see the children making up their own stories from a wordless picture book is just really exciting to me. So those sorts of books need to be included. Again, when we talk about, in higher grades, boys particularly not reading at certain points, how are we defining reading? Do we mean, they're not reading narrative fiction? Because they're doing a lot of reading, but it may just not be in our sense of what they ought to be reading, if you see what I mean. So that goes back to enabling the child to make those choices, and that the teacher is also making her choice and just sitting there reading as well as the kids, not sort of supervising them or assessing them. Is part of that empowerment, I think. We've just got too much emphasis on quantifying in our society. It's not the quantity of reading, it's the quality of it. It's the kids loving the reading. It's a book that, if I go back to the best moments in my parenting, one day I remember watching two boys, 8 years old, fighting physically over the book Slugs, a book of poems, and actually tearing the book in half over who was going to get to read it. That sort of enthusiasm is just priceless, I think.
Yep. So kids having access to, reading, especially when they don't have much access to it. I was at a school where the boy lost his borrowing rights to the library. He didn't have any books at home, and at that stage there weren't many books in the classroom. So he didn't have much access to reading at all.
And that's where the school plays such an important role. I mean, interestingly, in disadvantaged homes sometimes, there's an emphasis on worthwhile books. And so, books that the kids might love, like the Dogman series, may be frowned upon because they don't seem educational enough. And therefore, for the school to include that in its library collection and in classroom independent reading is a real gift to that child. As for turning reading into a punishment, you haven't returned the books. Well, I'm thinking of Margaret Clark's story about the vampire librarian who goes around from house to house with a coffin in the hearse, collecting the books that haven't been returned to the library. There are librarians who are actually quite happy when books are stolen, or when books just disappear.
Yeah, there
because
are.
they think, well, they really cared about that book,
and they need those books.
Yeah.
And I really love it when principals who commit to having classroom libraries, and so to having, quite large collections of books in classrooms, say, that same sort of thing of if books go missing, we'll be really pleased, that it's not about, and that they're consumables in the classroom. We're not even barcoding them. We just want to get them into kids' hands and have children actually burning to read because they'll find things that they want to read and that we build those collections based on their interests, and
because it's an experience. It's not a thing. It's not a kind of art object to put on a shelf and admire. I mean, there are such collectible books and people do that, which is kind of silly. I think it's about as interesting as, book wallpaper, really. But I mean, if the book gets tattered and falls apart and it's a bit grubby and so on, okay, that means it's been much loved. And if you have to buy another copy, then go for it. Places a lot of emphasis on keeping library budgets at a healthy level. We've seen years of cutbacks in libraries. We've seen years of cutbacks of teacher librarians. I mean, that is so tragic. If people remember back to Kevin Rudd's election campaign, there was one plank in that platform that said a teacher librarian in every school. What happened to that one? That was a terrific goal because the librarian is actually the person who draws together all the different disciplines of the school.
Yes.
Yeah. In fact,
and so reading is not just something that you do in English. Reading something you do in every subject you're doing.
Yeah.
There are schools that have actually gotten rid of their libraries.
Oh, hard to believe, isn't it?
Isn't it? Yeah. Yep. Can't believe it, really.
So if a school was thinking that, they must, based on research, I'm guessing if they're saying, let's not have independent reading, let's not use time at school for students to be reading, what would be the good research-based thing they would be doing instead of that?
Oh, wow, who knows? I mean, what do you know? Because I really, that time devoted to reading is absolutely crucial for children, and particularly the kids who don't come from a home where there's a lot of reading. That's, I appreciate that parents are busy and they're work focused and everybody's stressed out like crazy at the moment. But some of the reading games that people play at home, some of the word games are just terrific, And I mean, my kids and grandchildren's bedroom is like a bookshop.
Yes.
That's really exciting because, you've heard one person after another say that a bookshop in their childhood was like a lolly shop, They could choose anything they liked. And that freedom. And I watch it when somebody says, oh, Granddad will read you a book before you go to bed. And the answer is, well, you choose, and the kids love that. And sometimes I think if I have to read one more Angelina Ballerina book or whatever it is, I think I'll go crazy. But I love the children's enjoyment of it.
Yes.
And the fact that I don't particularly love it doesn't cost me much,
No.
So is it more your viewpoint that we should have independent reading in schools as opposed to not having it? If a teacher was just having, say, reading activities where we had a comprehension sheet or we had something else, and but we didn't have that independent time to practice with our reading, you're saying the research is contradictory as to the value of that being in the middle to upper grades, but as your viewpoint would be to have it anyway. Is that what you would say?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, my preferred approach is sustained silent reading, to be honest.
Okay. Yep.
I don't really want. I think part of the problem is that teachers we expect too much of them as far as planning and accountability is concerned. John Watson said years ago, "Who let economists take over the English language?" And I think he's so right. Accountability. What an irritating word that is. It assumes that if we can't exactly specify the outcomes today or in the next little while, then the activity wasn't worth doing. Anybody dealing with confident readers knows that a book can make an impact years later.
Yeah.
When I was leaving school, when I was 17, a teacher I didn't even like said to me, "Mark Macleod, before you go to university, I want you to read one book, and that's Room at the Top." Now, everybody's forgotten Room at the Top. That's 100 years ago. I did read it, and I thought, why does she want me to read that book? It has a pregnancy in it, an unwanted pregnancy. It has, all sorts of things in there. Maybe she thought I was a very naive child and needed some education on such things. I don't really know. But, all these years later, I've remembered her saying that. And that's kind of what Jim Trelease has said for many years in the Read Aloud Handbook and other places, where he said it almost doesn't matter what the book is. It almost doesn't matter. What the child will remember is that you bothered to put aside time, you bothered to turn the lights down low, and you bothered to turn the TV off, and you gave yourself to that child for that time of reading and talking about the book. That's so powerful, and some of my most wonderful experiences as a teacher and as a parent and as a publisher too have been those sorts of special moments where somebody says, that book was just for me.
Yep.
That's such a powerful point. And I'm just wondering then, I can't remember who, might have even been the International Literacy Association as an organisation, who said that, in trying to find, there are so many things about reading that just can't be measured, that maybe that's why we don't have the research that can, how can research back that? That's just a lived thing, isn't it?
I think our society became very worried about the time that we wanted to have websites talking about, measuring the ladders of achievement of schools, and where we became very competitive and so on. It's a materialist attitude towards those experiences, and not everything can be measured that way. No. You said before, Sharon, we can't assume that a child's silence means that there's nothing going on inside.
Yeah,
that child may have decided that that book didn't need expression, that the book is perfect in itself and the reading experience was perfect. And that's why it's so important. Look, really, in the long run, if schools have, ditched silent reading to sustain silent reading because it seems a bit too loose, if they really are worried about teachers sort of sitting there just reading and chatting to one child on one, then fine, let's have a bit more structure in it. Maybe scaffolded silent reading, maybe independent reading, I don't know. But the basic desire of all those programs is that we should have lots of variety, that there should be a lot of fun, that the children should make choices, that they can set their own goals and be rewarded by their own progress rather than a sort of grade or a mark or whatever it is, or a gold star. I think we got it wrong. I think that's our materialistic society. If it can't be measured, if it can't be bought and sold, then it's probably a bit sus.
Yes. Yeah. And there's one word that rings out through all of this that absolutely can't be measured on any assessment form, and that is students' motivation to read, to be, and to be a reader, to know what it is to choose a book or to find an author or to have had that thought or to have made that discovery or to have just dreamt or imagined or whatever it is, all of that part, that's actually the entire richness of it all.
To see that your mother is going to burn whatever's on the stove because she's so engrossed in a book, what a great learning moment that is.
Yes.
It may not be a great eating moment, but it'll be a great learning moment.
Yeah.
And I really want to, I think we've gone through some really, I don't know. I think sometimes we've dumbed down the complexity of our experience into this tribal, you're inside the tent, you're outside the tent nonsense, which unfortunately social media promote. But it seems to me that the teachers who are most effective are the ones who will do whatever it takes. So it's not phonics versus something else. It's if the teaching of the sounding out of words is useful, then let's do it. If context is useful, let's do that. If independent reading is useful, let's do that. It's kind of like, and that comes back to trusting teachers. Teachers are professionals, man.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
And if you don't treat them as a professional, what are you going to do? You just give them a script that they got to follow? What's the alternative?
Yeah, right. Give them a script like the people on Telstra do, when you ring up for a complaint. And I say, please don't read that script to me again. But that's all they've been taught to do,
Yeah.
I mean, I felt that was really sad, to be honest, when supermarkets started to be so busy and everything that you couldn't talk to the person at the checkout, Talking to the person, that human contact's just so important.
Yeah.
As soon as we script everything, what the scripting does is it's a great sort of authoritarian measure, isn't it? You've got a lot to do, so you just set out all these paradigms and you say, go and do that. But that devalues the individual talent of the teacher, their creativity, the fact that one teacher will teach a book quote really effectively and powerfully and another won't. But then we read that way too.
Yes.
That's why I love being an English teacher. If there was just one reading of the poem, then let's run it off and give everybody a copy, and then we can all go home and do something way more interesting. The reason for sitting in a classroom or sitting in a Zoom gallery and exchanging views is that other people read differently from the way we do, and we learn from that. When I went to teach at Charles University, we were obliged to do a course in constructive alignment. I gritted my teeth the whole way. I hate it because, yes, of course, as a teacher and as a lifelong professional in various areas, I want to make sure that we achieve something at the end of something, that whoever it is, whether it's a set of writers or whether it's a set of students or parents that I'm talking to, that they get somewhere that they wanted to go. But the idea that you have an absolute identity between your goals, your aims, and your outcomes, that's just kind of bookkeeping. That's a kind of quantifying approach, an accountability approach. That's what Watson's saying. Who let accountants and economists take over the language? I mean, go back to the sayings during the 60s. If you always do what you've always done, then you'll always get what you've always got.
When that website came in where schools started to get compared and we saw everyone's results, that really was a turning point in where education was going, I thought. Yeah.
I hate it. I hate it.
Yeah.
And it was a political move, and it was a move to kind of counter the people who thought that teachers basically
can't be trusted.
Look, as a teacher and as a bookseller, I have always been aware that there are some people who think they could do the job better than I can. And that's so demeaning.
Yes.
And there's something in Australian culture that is sort of cynical or sceptical about professionalism sometimes, and it's so demoralising for people who are on the receiving end of that. It's about dollars. It's about dollars, you know, and votes. Again, you know, just because you can't absolutely measure it, you know, doesn't mean it's not going to have a huge impact down the line. You don't know what that child choosing that book for independent reading this hour, what that result is going to be in 5 years' time if the book's a powerful one.
Always thought when I was teaching, you know, how do you measure an idea? You know, you can't. You can't. You get your ruler out and try and measure that idea. Like, okay.
Well, and then on the other side of that too is that what can be measured, you know, what measure are we using?
Yeah.
And then what does that mean for opening the doors? I'm coming right back to where we began, you know, like the doors need to open. Like we don't want ceilings on, you know, that we're going to get to this or we're going to get to that. We want those doors wide open so that our students, that's what we want as teachers, so our students can go as far as they can with their thinking, their creativity, their thoughts, their ideas.
And teachers are masters at knowing where their children, what they're discovering, what they're doing, because they're right there with those kids. They don't need a NAPLAN test to tell them, you know, that they've made this amazing discovery today, you know.
They don't, and I think they could also be trusted to manage the child's behaviour in the classroom, you know. The responsibility of a teacher to ring up the parent or email the parent and say, well, she did so-and-so today, you know, and this might need attention. Not only does that give the parents an anxiety that they might not need to have, but it kind of has this reporting aspect to it again, you know, the lack of freedom for the teacher to go, okay, this isn't really working with that child. Let's sit with it for a while. I don't necessarily need to be accountable to the parents on that. I think I would like to give teachers way more freedom and go back to the idea of trusting them and their professional judgment.
Yes,
absolutely. And we'll get so much more out of the profession if we do that. You know.
Oh yeah, because they feel that they're doing what we've always known anyway, that it's worthwhile.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And everyone wants to feel like what they're doing is worthwhile and that they're worthwhile.
Yeah, of course. And I'm going back to risks and the unexpected. You know, I love that. Obviously, it's something in the air at the moment. People are talking repeatedly about that Japanese mending a pottery with gold and how it highlights faults rather than hides them. I think that's a really beautiful image.
Yes.
And, you know, the fact that something didn't exactly turn out the way you expected it to might be the best gift you could give to the class.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
That a kid came up with something. It's like me walking into the classroom and they're in cadet uniforms and I hadn't expected that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
What a mind-blowing experience, which I could not have constructed.
I feel like the topic of our podcast has to change to the value of teacher professionalism. But we can have both.
Well, really, people who are throwing shade on independent reading are questioning that, I think.
That's it, and that's exactly.
Yes.
I'm sitting here thinking.
Yep.
How did we actually get to a point where teachers? It's being brought into question for teachers the value of actually giving children opportunities to read at school.
Yeah,
like
how can you question that?
How do we question that?
Yeah, it's all about trying to.
Well, I also want to know what the parents know of what is actually happening in the classroom. When books were, and this is still the case in the United States, when books are challenged or censored, it so often turns out that the parent hasn't actually read the book, and there is a need to demonstrate an involvement in what's going on in the classroom. Not always with great foundations, I think. Before criticising what's going on as independent reading in the classroom, maybe make sure that you know exactly what that involves, and you might be surprised.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I think we've come full circle there, and it's been a great conversation, Mark. Thank you so much for all your incredible insight, and I think you've rebalanced everyone's thoughts out there to get back into the teacher as a professional, as well as great insights about independent reading. But it's rebalancing into the world of trusting the teacher.
Yes.
Well, I hope every parent will get caught reading a children's book and wordless books, picture books. Dog Man, read it on the bus or on the train.
Yes. Yeah.
Why not?
Yeah, I know. Let's get reading.
Yep.
Let's all be reading.
All right. Thanks very much for being with us today, Mark, and hopefully we can have you another time. Okay.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Sharon, very much.
And thanks, Sharon. And thank you, everyone. Bye for now.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. To make sure you don't miss any literacy learning tips and insights, please subscribe to our show on your favourite podcast player. At Q Learning, our literacy specialists draw on over 30 years of teaching and international consulting experience to deliver world-class learning solutions. We equip, empower and support teachers to become their authentic selves. To find out about upcoming webinars and about how Q can help you and your school, visit qlearning.com.au. And you can get even more amazing teaching resources right now at teachific.com.au. Stay tuned.